Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe. Really glad you're joining us this morning, or this morning. It could be early morning, or it could be you could be into your cup of tea in the afternoon for a really important city talk about the National Housing Council's work in soliciting feedback on the National Housing Strategy. Boy, oh boy, we're at a moment, aren't we, folks? It's a really interesting moment, not only in urban life, but in life across the country as we come to terms with all sorts of changes as the virus abates, but other kinds of challenges are pushing themselves into us now. And I appreciate I'm in Ottawa today, which is the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people, the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, now called Ottawa. We live with and continue to struggle with as urbanists the legacies of colonialism and the consequences of not respecting and finding ways to actually honor the right to housing. And this report that's being released today really underscores, I think, the systemic nature of this and how we are struggling collectively to mitigate, address, and actually create something quite different in terms of how we build housing and how we house and provide shelter and homes for people and for ourselves across the country. So thanks for joining us. We have a terrific group panel that are coming on. So I'm asked them to turn their screens on so that you can all see them. And I think this conversation is, as we always say with City Talk, this is just the beginning, so we've only got the hour, 60 minutes, 58 minutes and counting, to try to raise some issues. Please use the chat if you can. If you're one of those people who signs into City Talk and is shy and doesn't actually use the chat, we hope you watch the chat because there's a whole parallel universe there, and people identify where they're coming in from, which is very helpful, I think, for all of us to know where have we gathered. Where are we gathering from? And also to raise questions and put in resources and answers, because there's no silver bullet here. There is no magic answer. It's a complicated thing, but that doesn't mean it's not worth tackling. And it doesn't mean, of course, that it's not crucially important. So please use the chat. And as you know, what goes in the chat stays in the chat, and hopefully we will post the chat for people to look at afterwards. I had a request for this session last week because the chat was kind of on fire and there were all sorts of great ideas there. And sure enough, somebody wrote me and said, can I get access to the chat? I want to go back and look. So as I say, this is our moment in time, but it's also a process of where we're trying to understand what the real challenges are and what are the key interventions that we can all be making and that we can advocate to be made to really fix what's a profound challenge, something in my lifetime that I'm old, that I don't recall being quite so acute, where we really have across the spectrum of housing and the housing continuum in this country, rural, urban, suburban, small, big, Indigenous, remote, central, we have a very, very pernicious challenge around how, in fact, we're building places to live. So with all that aside, I'm going to first go to Cassandra, who is going to give you a bit of an overview of the report that's been released today. And I'm sure my colleagues at COI have put the link in there. So download, get your copy, get it here of the What We Heard report. Cassandra will give you a bit of a summary, and then I'm going to go to Maya to talk a little bit about the work of the council. And then I'm going to ask our guests who are involved in different components of this to give us some early comments. And then we'll have a roundtable conversation. And as I say, the chat will light up as it always does. So over to you, Cassandra. Thanks for joining us and welcome to City Talk.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks for having me here. It's been a pleasure working with CUI on this work on behalf of the National Housing Council. So what our team did was conducted a survey, interviews, and a series of 6 regional and national sessions across the country to hear from stakeholders involved in housing and homelessness, to get their insights into what was working well with the National Housing Strategy, what are the gaps and challenges, and what changes are needed to improve programs. So we had almost 200 people share their insights and ideas on these topics. And so I'm just going to share with you today some of the highlights of what we heard. From the perspective of what's working well, I think one of the key things is just the fact that the National Housing Strategy is in place compared to previous periods where the federal government hadn't been as actively involved in homelessness and housing needs. The fact that the NHS recognizes the right to housing was another key aspect of what's working well. And the fact that it has a range of programs incorporated into the strategy to address various needs. From a program perspective, we heard a lot about the Rapid Housing Initiative as being one of the key programs that's actually working well to address core housing need and homelessness. Then in terms of what's needed, one of the things that came out loud and clear was the need to increase investments in Indigenous housing and the need to implement a for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. One of the other key things that we heard was around the National Housing Strategy's targeting of core housing need and homelessness. Stakeholders would like to see more transparency from the federal government in how the National Housing Strategy funds are being used and the outcomes that are being achieved. They'd like to see expansion of the National Housing Strategy to include various groups that aren't included, either excluded from the priority groups or are inadequately served, groups like women, students. We also heard about the need to re-examine the program definitions of affordable housing to ensure that the funding is really going to support those with deep levels of affordability need. So things like the rental construction financing initiative, stakeholders talked about a desire to reallocate that funding to better target core housing need. And then in order to address core housing need and homelessness, we really heard a lot about the need for deeper grants rather than repayable loans, accompanied by rental assistance or operating subsidies to make it affordable to those on the lowest end of the income spectrum. One of the other things that we heard a lot about was the loss of affordable housing that's really occurring at an alarming rate across this country, and the issue of financialization that's having negative impacts on affordability and displacing tenants. To address that, stakeholders really saw the need for the NHS to incorporate support for nonprofit organizations to acquire and then rehabilitate existing affordable private rental housing stock across the country that's at risk of being lost, and as well, really focusing on scaling up nonprofit, affordable, non-market housing development, as well as the need for some dedicated funding to repair and renew the existing community housing that exists across the country. Another thing that we heard a lot about was the shortcomings that exist in the income supports across this country. And in that area, I think stakeholders would like to see the federal government expand the reach of the Canada Housing Benefit. And some also suggested that Canada Housing Benefit should actually become a universal program, as opposed to a program that's limited to only a portion of eligible households. Another area that we heard about was that many vulnerable Canadians can't maintain housing stability if their housing doesn't come along with wraparound supports. But those supports are often not connected to the affordable housing supply programs within the National Housing Strategy. So stakeholders are looking for funding for supports to be incorporated directly into those new supply programs, or that there's specific linkages attached to capital funding from the federal government to provincial funding for supports, for example, through bilateral agreements that require integration of supports. And then the last area that we heard about the need for changes is really around the program delivery processes. So we heard a number of suggestions for making the programs easier for nonprofits and co-ops to access to develop new affordable housing. So here we heard about a desire for more consolidated or stackable programs that people can access different combinations of funding, whether that's grants in combination with low cost, flexible mortgage loan insurance. We heard about a desire for some direct allocations to regions, similar to what was done with the Rapid Housing Initiative City Stream. We heard about the need for greater flexibility in the funding to use to address specific community needs, having more predictability in the funding so nonprofits can plan and go about the development process. More grants, more rental assistance. Stakeholders also want to see approvals for funding earlier in the development process, as well as support for the acquisition of land. Some other areas were incorporating additional underwriting flexibilities, and really supporting investing in the expertise and resources of nonprofits and co-ops to allow them to better deliver affordable housing developments. And then finally, I think stakeholders were also looking for improvements in the quality of the supports being delivered by CMHC, providing that knowledgeable and consistent direction and support for applicants looking to develop affordable housing.
Thanks, Cassandra. I mean, all sorts of, listen, I appreciate it. I've been digging into the report since it was made available, and I encourage everyone else to do so as well. Many, many, many things that surfaced. And this is the old adage, the wisdom of crowds. Like, there is benefit to going out to such a broad cross section of folks to be able to get a sense of, are there some common things that will inform whatever the National Housing Strategy 2.0 needs to look like? I think that's part of the mandate of the council, Maya. Can you talk a little bit about what the National Housing Council's objective has been? And then I'll go from you, then I want to come to Thomas to talk a little bit about Blueprints work, but go to you first, Maya.
Thank you, Mary. So at the National Housing Council, our role is essentially as an advisory body and as a convener, bringing together broad cross-section of stakeholders to really not just explore how we can improve the national housing strategy, but really start to drill down based on the data and based on the evidence around unpacking the human rights lens and the systemic barriers to affordable housing. You shared in your land acknowledgement being on unceded territory as a guest on the land of Toronto, the territory, the Mississaugas of the First Nation. We know that there's a lot of systemic barriers and colonization that's perpetuated in housing policy. We also know that what gets measured gets done. So at the National Housing Council, we really appreciate CUI's work and Blueprints work around pulling together the data and the evidence. And we've been very much been leaning on, for example, colleagues at Maitri who've really talked about, what does a human rights-based approach to policy look like? And was very privileged a few months ago, was invited to a presentation where Dr. Lewis also gave us some of his findings around, for example, looking at the intersections of socioeconomic location, anti-Black racism, and how this creates barriers to equity-seeking communities. So for us at the National Housing Council, I think pulling together broad stakeholders and having these really important policy conversations around looking at key performance indicators for NHS. That's ultimately where we're going. And based on your findings and your evidence in this report that's released today, the National Housing Council has been meeting and will essentially be developing some recommendations based on your evidence and on your findings.
Thanks, Maya. There's this discussion in urbanism all the time about who's an expert. And how much we're informed by, and we saw it during the pandemic, people saying, well, are we being informed by science? And I think the dilemma is that there are competing perspectives from experts. And then there's the lived experience story of people that have actually been caught with the system dysfunction and find themselves unhoused or inadequately housed. And so I appreciate what the council is trying to do is, in essence, have a conversation at several levels at once. And the report also does that. And so I just want to encourage all of us to recognize that, there are policy changes that need to happen at the federal, provincial, municipal level. And then there are issues in the market. And then there are issues that are regulatory issues. And then there are just attitudinal issues around neighborhoods and how we accept people who aren't like us to live with us. So it's a multi-layered thing. I guess that's what I was going to say. I'm going to come to you, Thomas, and then Nimoy, I want to come to you after. Thomas, talk to us a little bit about where Blueprints intersection is on this. And then Liz, you're playing cleanup. So we'll go Thomas and then Nimoy and then Elizabeth. Go ahead, Thomas.
Okay, looking for a grand slam from
Absolutely.
Elizabeth. Um, okay, so thanks, Mary. Thanks everybody for having me here. I'm kind of both honored and humbled to be on this panel with all you thinkers, movers, and shakers, broadly speaking. So I manage a team at Blueprint that's been over the last year working with the National Housing Council. Shout out Maya, Tim Richter, and so on, to do some more quantitative, crunchy analysis to complement the work of CUI on kind of just looking at what's happened because of the NHS. We published a report earlier in the year on the unilateral supply programs, the RCFI, and so on. And we have a forthcoming report on the bilateral programs, along with an additional sort of addendum to our work on the RHI. I'll say that the opinions that I'm going to express here today are my own, and they're informed by my work, but they're also informed by my history working specifically with the National Housing Collaborative, which was an organization that worked to put together some recommendations for the National Housing Strategy at its inception. So about our work, I'll say it aligns quantitatively with the CUI consultation findings that Cassandra, you just very, very thoughtfully went through. I'll give you a couple highlights. The RCFI's affordability criteria haven't made affordable units. Affordable market rental stock has declined along with community housing, non-market rental stock. I will say that if it were an entitlement, the Canada Housing Benefit would make a much bigger impact on housing need, but that there are some design considerations that you would want to incorporate or think about that aren't especially relevant as a waitlisted budget limited program, but that would become very relevant as an entitlement. And the distinction between grants and loans is very important. So that we also found that really lines up with Cassandra's what Cassandra was talking about. More broadly on the NHS, this is sort of shifting to my personal takes as a researcher and policy analyst. I think it's really important for us to kind of back up and ask the question of what the NHS is. And if we start with kind of the spirit of the NHS, like is it a big step in the direction of solving Canadian society's affordable housing woes? I would suggest that it hasn't been that. Homeownership is less accessible to the middle class than it was in 2016-17, in spite of recent gentle corrections to the housing market. Rents continue to increase faster than incomes. Social housing wait lists are large and growing, and the stock is not projected to increase really substantially over the next 5-10 years. Our work focuses on answering the question of, does it do what it says on the cover? And to the extent that it makes firm commitments to doing stuff, it also falls short of those targets. So I think it's more important to know that we need something more to solve the societal problems around housing, but then also that it is on its own terms not on track to fulfill its commitments. I would say, though, that it's not quite fair to hold it to that standard, because while it was announced as a really significant investment, when you look deeper at the financial reality of the NHS's funding envelope, about half of it is non-budgetary loans, which are really limited in the subsidy that they provide. And then another all but about 5 billion of it is replacing expiring operating agreements and other pieces of funding. So I think it's not fair to hold it really to either of those standards. I think what I ultimately feel it does, and what I ultimately feel it is a reassertion of federal control and centralized control over the design and delivery of housing support programs across Canada. That has a lot of potential advantages in terms of agility, in terms of using evidence to drive policymaking, in terms of monitoring and accountability. But our work and our experience getting information from CMHC, working with the information that we've gotten, tells us that those potential advantages have not been capitalized on. But on a positive note, the response from CMHC to our first report, which ended up incorporating the thinking of the council driven by our findings into the budget in terms of the RCFI's affordability criteria. I think there is a hunger for evidence. There's a hunger for making for making responsive policy, and
Right.
I would suggest there just isn't that muscle memory. So thanks. Sorry if I blew through my time.
No, it's fine. I just want to make sure I get the others in as well, and then we can circle back to the points that you're raising, because as you're suggesting, it takes a number of inputs. Public policy isn't nimble and easy and flexible and responsive. It takes, it's a lot of folks, it's a lot of people, it's a lot of jurisdictions. So I hear you on that, and I can imagine it has. I'm sure there are lots of people on this call who have their moments of fatigue. Nimoy, let's go to you, the newly named Toronto Metropolitan University. Glad to see you here, and give us a sense of your particular perspective as a person who knows the literature and knows what the academic community is trying to advocate for. And then, as I said, Elizabeth will clean up and hit a home run, just like Thomas suggested. Go ahead, Nimoy.
I think what the academic community is trying to advocate for is, truly a human rights approach to housing. I think one of the things that I struggle with is sort of the policies that are being adopted at all levels of government, which which I argue often takes precedence over Canadians' needs for shelter. I think that's one of the biggest difficulty I think that we have with respect to some of the policies. I think at the federal level, I think that when the NHS was announced, I think that it was a great strategy in terms of a great initiative in what we're trying to do to address the housing crisis. But we have to recognize that the federal government cannot do it on its own. There are provincial policies that are put in place that sort of contradicts a lot of the work that the federal government is trying to do to address some of the issues with respect to the housing crisis. But I think one of the things that I think is important as well is that these particular policies that we are trying to enact to address the housing crisis should be policies that I believe should be addressing some of the most vulnerable segments of our population. And where, from my research, I've been able to gather that some of the issues that folks are facing within the private rental space has been very disheartening with respect to affordability and displacement. But I think one of the things that we should also be mindful of is enacting policies that truly respect and acknowledge a human rights approach to housing. I think that from my research, from what I've gathered, is that financialized landlords have been increasing their acquisition of multifamily units across this country, primarily in major urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. I know within the Toronto market, within the last 5 years, financialized landlords have been accounting for roughly about between 75 to 80% of the multifamily units that are exchanging hands. And I think that should be of a concern. And I think one of the things that we should be concerned about is the fear of the creation of an oligopolistic rental market, which doesn't create a lot of competition. But one of the things is that it creates is an unaffordable rental market. So I definitely think that we need to be addressing these particular issues, but we also need to be addressing the issues of how these particular entities impact the lived experiences and neighborhood choices of racialized renters, particularly Black renters, in major urban centers, and how their investment and everyday management practices restrict their mobility and their ability to define and shape urban centers.
I guess we should, I mean, I'm interested to just, you're echoing in some of what Thomas was saying about, how much can you expect from one strategy? I guess that's the question, is the national housing strategy, oh, done, we got a national housing strategy, versus what you're raising, which is that there are a whole bunch of factors here that no one single ministry or department is going to touch on. So, and I think we've all seen that happen over the last 5, 7. I know there are many of you who've been tracking this for decades. So you would say, oh, look, I saw it in the 70s. But in the last 8 years, we've seen the way the market has behaved, and no national housing strategy is going to get, I guess, at the financial market. And Nimoy's raising this point that there are perpetual, back to the land acknowledgement we did at the beginning, there are these perpetual colonial and exclusionary and racist policy practices that influence everything we do. I want to go to Maitrey next, because Maitrey's been at this for a couple of decades, trying to push at these kinds of a confluence of a bunch of systems that then hit the road together and create, and we see it in the housing thing. So Elizabeth, what is your particular perspective for Maitrey in terms of the long thread of observing that you've been doing and funding and resourcing that the foundation's been making? What's your sense of the housing piece and what you think the national housing strategy gets at, or needs to get at, or can't get at? Go. Oh, she froze just as I asked her. Wouldn't you know? Nick will get Liz back, and in the meantime, I'm going to go. Oh, go ahead, Maya. Do you want to jump in while we'll reassure Elizabeth that she's in a very thoughtful pose there that
Yes.
she's frozen in.
She looks great.
Yeah, she's very, very learned. Okay, go ahead, Maya.
Sort of Maitrey, their solution-focused approach to policy, but just your point, Mary, around those racist colonial practices and that reproduction piece that you had named in the land acknowledgement. I mean, one of the things that came out during the What We Heard sessions that your team organized, for example, from Indigenous housing service providers, despite Indigenous children and youth being one of the fastest growing demographic sections of the population in Canada, one of the things that Indigenous service providers pointed out was, for example, they're not allowed to apply for so-called mainstream funding.
Crazy.
So again, there's literally a penalty or that systemic anti-Indigenous racism baked in to the system. So the fact that we were hearing this kind of feedback from the What We Heard sessions, now it's about looking at, okay, we have an EARN Indigenous working group under the National Housing Council. They've put together an incredible report and proposed strategy based on a distinctions-based approach. Again, we know that Indigenous community members are not a homogeneous monolith, but I think those really tough questions, Mary, that you're asking, that Dr. Lewis is asking through his research and his findings are really important, because sometimes it's in the details of decision making, of how funding is allocated There really should, as long as an Indigenous nonprofit service provider meets all the due diligence requirements, there should be no barriers for them to apply for mainstream funding. So I think how do we set up stakeholders to succeed is also a really important question. And your data in speaking with the 200 stakeholders really started to get at some of those, how do we untangle this wicked problem?
Yeah, if I could ask you all to turn your mics on, and apparently the power had went off at Matry and it's coming back, and they're going to try to get, Liz will try to get back on. But if I could get Cassandra and Nimoy and Thomas and Matt, open your mics so that we can have a bit of an open chat here. One of the things that strikes me, and I can see it in the chat, is that we get a little overwhelmed by this. It's so many things. And where do we start? And so, as Cassandra said off the top, some of the feedback you got in the listening process was that people are grateful that there actually was an effort to create a national housing strategy, and it did elevate the issue as opposed to if it wasn't operating under the radar. But now that we can see that there are, Thomas, you said it flat out, it's not actually solving the problem. So I guess the question I would have for you folks, based on what you're thinking, and you can see in the chat, people are saying, is it dealing with climate? Are we looking at alternative tiny home type? Are we looking at alternative ways of encouraging different kinds of housing? Are we looking at housing trusts? Are we looking at how to deal with secondary rentals and the whole short-term rental market? And one of the things that I hear regularly is, do we need to double down on resourcing the not-for-profit sector to try to level that playing field? Because we know that the affordability stock largely is going to come from the not-for-profit sector. So if you had to pick two areas that you would focus on, and that the feedback is telling you to focus on, Cassandra, I want to come back to you. Did you hear something that, I really don't want to use that phrase, low-hanging fruit, but what's the most effective intervention to start with? Did you hear anything like that from people?
Easy, we say easy wins.
Easy wins. Is easy wins the new phrase, Thomas? Because you're right that if people feel, I was actually going to ask Nimoy, that phrase positive deviance, where you actually look at stuff that works instead of spending all your time talking about everything that doesn't work. Are there some easy wins, low-hanging fruit, positive deviance? Are there ways we could actually make some inroads? Cassandra first, and then maybe Nimoy. Oh, yeah. And Liz, we'll come to you in a sec.
I think the thing that we heard most often of what will make some inroads is giving nonprofits the tools to increase their share of the market, and in particular, the existing housing stock, the existing rentals that
to not lose that, because that's one of the
not lose that.
You're all saying that there's this vulnerable part of the housing stock inventory that's getting scooped up by the big bad meanies called private equity or whoever it is, the REITs, and you're saying get some resources and some tools in the hands of not-for-profits to at least hold on to that stuff. Yes?
Yeah. Yes, because we can never build our way, it would take incredible amount of resources to build our way out of the loss, and we need to stop it, the additional loss from occurring, to really keep
stem the flow. So the first thing, okay. Yeah. So Nimoy, can I go to you, and then Liz, we're going to come to you now that the power's back on in sunny Toronto. Nimoy, and then we'll go to Elizabeth at North. Go ahead, Nimoy.
I think that some of the wins that I think that we could get, to be efficient is, enacting better policies. And then when I say enacting better policies, these are enacting policies that ensure that the housing that we are actually providing is affordable in perpetuity, and not just affordable for a period of 10, 25, 30 years, inclusive of a 5-year phase out period. I think that we need to actually create investment policies within the housing sector that ensures that housing remains affordable. And I think one of the things is that what we should also be thinking about is how we are defining affordability. We've mentioned affordability so much, but we've yet to define what affordability is, and affordable to whom. I think this is some of the much bigger questions that I think that we are avoiding. I think, and especially even considering in an inflationary period, I think that the definition of affordability needs to be addressed. And then the other things that I think that we could do as well is limiting the amount of rental units that these particular entities have, meaning there's the private equity firms, the asset management firms, insurance companies, and two other entities that we don't talk a whole lot about, who either invest directly in housing or invest through financial intermediaries, and those are public pension funds. Our public pension funds, what I argue are essentially invested in our own displacement to secure pensioners' long-term financial security. And I think these are some of the things that we need to address in terms of how public pension funds are invest in their funds, and also universities. Universities invest as well within these financial intermediaries through their endowments and through the pensions as well. I think that we need to re-examine how these particular entities are complicit in our housing crisis.
So we don't just need CMHC and INFC on this call listening, and all the ministries of housing across the province. We need the Ministry of Finance. We need the regulators to be starting to think about this, about how money's actually moving. Elizabeth, that might be a good segue into you. Why don't we hear from you what Maitre's perspective is?
So my apologies, I got kicked out, and so I might have missed a couple of things. So if I'm not carrying the thread properly, I apologize for not a good clean sweep. I actually wanted to go back to, I think, one of the earlier comments around the big success of the NHS is that we're now recognizing the right to housing. And I think recognizing the right to housing is the first step of it. What needs to happen now is institutionalizing and building the accountability mechanisms around that. And I heard some threads of that through Cassandra's comments, through Maya's comments, and Thomas as well, and also Nimoy. So to what extent are we actually delivering some transparent data and outcomes around how the different programs have delivered for those in greatest need? I think it's important to recognize that the strategy actually predated the National Housing Strategy Act. And so the commitment to the right to housing and all that entails, and it's not just about better policy, these are actually obligations in law. And how do we build that into the DNA of policies, that we have that human rights lens, that we are focusing on those in greatest need, that we are measuring the progressive realization, that we are dedicating maximum available resources to the problem that we're trying to solve, so that while we still have, 1.7 million people in core housing need and over 235,000 people in Canada each year experiencing homelessness, we need to know if we're making progress. And none of them are single tools. None of them are single policies. They are they take many different approaches, but we need a mechanism or instrument that actually rolls this up and tells us, are these together working? What is working? What's not delivering? Who's left behind? How well are we doing for people with disabilities? Is universal design baked into some of the big shifts in money that's moving for housing developments? How are we measuring all of these things? And how are we holding ourselves to account to say, yes, making progress, more of that. No, actually isn't moving the marker. Affordability isn't being achieved. It's not affordable for whom? And then looking at, do we need to actually go back into the Canada Housing Benefit and reimagine it? We at Maitre, we do a whole lot of work on those who are in deep poverty. We put out something called Welfare in Canada report. And we have in every single province and territory in Canada, people who are receiving social assistance are not just living below the poverty threshold, they're living way below the deep poverty threshold. And so we have to imagine new tools and instruments to ensure that they have the dignity of a home. And that's the responsibility of the National Housing Strategy. And we haven't baked in a human rights lens to each of the program streams that are part of it. And we haven't looked at what's the roll-up of all of it in terms of how we're moving the marker. And that's, I think, the work to be done on the next iteration of the National Housing Strategy. I think we've had huge wins. I think we've put out a lot of things that we've tried. I'm excited that we have a housing council that's functioning the way it should, that's asking for the right research, that is giving good advice. That's exciting. We now have a housing advocate that's weighing in and taking claims and saying, focus your attention here. But this is also nascent. And so we think we have to be very attentive to what do we mean by a human right to housing? What's the instrument and mechanisms that we need to do that? and we need accountability mechanisms. I'll stop there.
Can I just come in on the heels of that? Thank you, Elizabeth. And I just want to say, as per usual, the chat is fascinating. And for those of you that have a corpus callosum, you can probably keep track of both. It's hard though. And they're doing a whole thing now on Windsor, what's going on in Windsor. So thanks, chatters. Very interesting, the specifics in Windsor. I have a question about jurisdiction for the 5 of you. And I heard it early, and Cassandra, you talked about, I think you called it, you didn't use the language that I would use, which is conditionality. And I think that's part of the challenge here. If you have something which is national, pan-Canada, and they put their marker on it and they say, we're going to invest in A, B, C, D, E, and we have declared housing as a human right. How do we then compel the provinces and the municipalities to actually do their part? Nimoy is nodding, so I might come to you next, Nimoy, because I feel like, let's take wraparound services. I know that there are municipalities on this call that will say that they got resources from the federal government, and the deal was that the provinces would come in with the wraparound, and then they didn't. So what is the answer to that thorny one? Nimoy, you take it first.
Sorry. I think you raised some very good points, Mary. Definitely one of the things that I stressed earlier was that the federal government is not going to be able to solve this issue, solve this crisis on its own. It's going to require a collective effort by all levels of government. But the other thing that I want to point out is that, when we talk about these wraparound service, supports, and especially in terms of a financial support, I think that we should be very cognizant of the fact that we are not providing these sort of one-time injection of support to help folks, to address their affordability needs for, 1 month out of the year, because then what happens in the other 11 months? And the other thing that I think that we should be mindful of it with these particular financial supports is that it doesn't actually address the immediate needs of those that are facing these affordable challenges. What it essentially does is that I feel that it perpetuates the very problem that we're actually trying to solve by taking funds and putting it into the pockets of the very people who are causing this crisis. And so I think that it's important that we are working collectively to address the needs of some of the most vulnerable segments of our population, but we are working collectively to preserve affordable housing. I think that we can't just focus on building our way out of this. We have to also focus on the particular processes and mechanisms and actors that are creating these displacement problems within some of these vulnerable communities. And I think that we need to address the particular policies that are creating exacerbating the affordability and displacement problems. And I think even the term displacement is not an accurate diagnosis to address the particular violence that is happening within these communities with respect to evictions and a dispossession, but more of an expulsion and a banishment of working class and racialized people from major urban centers.
And I guess your point here is that it's everybody's problem, like it's not confined to just one department, one ministry, one piece of national legislation. I guess that's the dilemma. I'm wondering if Thomas and Maya want to weigh in on this. I'm sure you're dealing with it as well, in terms of how do you do a whole of government approach?
Yes.
And go ahead, Maya, why don't you start?
I mean, I think in any federation, there's always that question, right? And those checks and balances, and there's always that practice tension of how do we have that pan-Canadian approach? In the same way with health, right? We wanted to take a human rights approach to health and having universal health care. But specifically, I think, and I would echo Dr. Lewis's comments that there is structural violence that's happening here. There are mechanisms and levers for the federal government. So for example, identifying certain statistics around reporting, giving, I think, as you mentioned, Mary, conditions around how certain funds should be spent. So for example, in the recent childcare agreements, when certain provinces and territories signed the childcare agreements with the federal government, there are certain questions around disaggregated data around specifically reporting back on how many Black identified and Indigenous and Métis children are actually being served by childcare. we could do something similar around disaggregated data and affordable housing.
Yep.
And also, you know, with a $40 billion fund, I know that's not sufficient in terms of meeting core housing need. Again, this goes back to the important data that CUI and Blueprint is pulling together for us. But $40 billion is still nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, it's a bit of
And so
dough.
how do we leverage that money? And just before I pass it over to Thomas, just to share with you a joke, although there's nothing funny about it. A number of us on this call were having a meeting a few months ago around financialization. And out of curiosity, as I left that call, one of the billionaires who heads up one of the property development firms, who was on actually one of your slides from the Federal Housing Advocate's Office, he happened to be in the room. So I actually had someone ask this billionaire a question around financialization, just curious to get his response. And he literally sighed and said, you know, $1 billion just doesn't go as far as it used to. So, you know, you can really see the disconnect around the consequences and the life and death impact of financialization. I mean, as many of the CUI colleagues are aware, during the What We Heard sessions, as you were pulling together this report, there were frontline staff talking about the opioid epidemic and that triple pandemic of gender-based violence, opioids, and structural poverty, and how they're literally finding 2 to 3 bodies a week. So, you know, I think to really center lived experiences, and if community members who with lived experience of structural poverty, if they're not seeing an impact a year from now, 3 years from now, then as a National Housing Council, you know, again, going back to the metrics, we're centering the needs of people with lived experiences around how we think about our measurement and how we think about our outcome framework for this work.
I mean, I hate to have another city talk where we lament the federation, but it is the dynamic, the dilemma in Canada. I see Sue UTech is here from Halifax. I'm seeing people. I'm sorry that we've lost Maribel. I think we had connectivity issues for Nunavut, but we'll do another one, and we're going to have to certainly do one on the particular experience of Inuit, Métis, and Indigenous of this particular challenge. So there'll be another city talk. Don't worry. But Thomas, do you want to add comments in here about how do we navigate? Just because it's difficult doesn't mean we don't have to try, right?
Well, yeah. So I spent the last week in Iqaluit, and part of it attending the Poverty Reduction Roundtable, which is an event organized by the Department of Family Services that brings together elders, representatives from the Inuit community, policymakers, and wonky consultants like me. And I want to share with you a moment from that roundtable that was really powerful to me. So there was a presentation from a consultant talking about kind of a new broad measure of housing sustainability in Inuit communities across Nunavut. And the concept that he presented was that, okay, once we have all this data, once we have all this information, we're going to be able to decide what kind of housing we need, what kind of things we need to ask the federal government for in order to address the needs of Inuit communities. And after that presentation, one of the elders stood up and said the following. He said, I have 12 children, and they have blessed me with 31 grandchildren. And if things keep going as they're going, none of those grandchildren are going to have houses in which to raise their families. So with all due respect, I hope this is the last study. I hope this is the last study before something happens.
Right.
And I think, I mean, I'm disappointed that Maribel wasn't able to join, but I think that makes me, I feel like that concept transcends just the northern situation.
Sure.
I feel like it's important to think, it's important to measure. I don't hope that it's the last study, but I do think we need to reorient ourselves towards action. We need to bias our policymaking towards action, and then reflection, and then adjustment, and then iteration.
Let me just, iteration, this cycle you're just suggesting, and I think that Nimoy is saying that too, like we need better policy from the start, and we need to be able to course correct more quickly. I think this is one of the challenges we have with the Federation, with Pan-Canada policy, is that you're trying to often make one size fit all, or one size fit many. And then what happens if it's wrong? So the RCFI, for instance, deeply criticized, and yet somebody in the chat is saying they know not-for-profits where it's working. So I'm kind of back, Cassandra, to the practicalities of what you heard in the feedback. If you got any sense of whether there were some top priorities, intervention points that needed to be done very quickly, because we're not going to solve the problem of the Federation. That I get, as much as we might say we need to. Did you get anything that surfaced when you were listening?
Yeah, I think, Mary, in terms of what you were speaking about the conditionality piece, I think we heard that different regions, different provinces have different resources available that they can leverage. So
right,
the broad solutions that are intended across the country aren't always working if the province can't come to the table with their contribution.
Doesn't have the dough, and yet we've got other provinces that may be sitting on a surplus, so they do have the dough. And I guess that's the question: can we get these policies? And I'd be interested, Elizabeth, your perspective on this. When you advocate for human rights approach, should we be working in jurisdictions where there's an explicit commitment and they have the resources, and they've got, let's say they've got a not-for-profit community? I'm thinking of BC. Basically, they've been able to move more quickly. So should we be centering on those and then figuring out what the models are? How do you see that from your perspective?
I don't have a global solution to this. I think that I think you have certain principles and conditions that you want to see met, and they might look different in each place. So BC may tick the obvious boxes, right? They've got a strong not-for-profit sector. They've got land trusts that have significant equity and so forth, and a government that's playing along. So they've got things that make it easier. But there's other tools that can come to play. So when we're looking at things like the Housing Accelerator Fund, are there provincial or municipal lands or federal lands that can be put on the table so that that's what they're bringing to the table, and there's something else there? Can you attach conditions to ensure that there's adequate participation of people with lived experience in some of the decision making? Or can you ensure require, before you flow funds, that certain elements or commitments can be made? Because I think you've got the power of money in setting up those agreements. And so it may not be obviously or easy to do, but I think you find different ways of working with each. It's not going to be a cookie cutter approach, because Canada's too complex for that. You're right.
Would you do more conditionality? I see my colleague from COI is saying, is this our moment for city deals, where the federal government says, we'll make these resources available, but here's the conditionality, and then the city comes back and says, we'll do A, B, C, D, E. Oh, we'd like transit, we'd like this, and is this the moment? As you say,
I think it is the moment. I think this is where you have, when we're committing the billions of dollars, and by the way, we're not even sure if it's enough billions of dollars, because we don't have a fixed quantum of what the problem is that we're trying to solve. But when we're putting in $40 billion, yes, put a condition attached to that. Nobody's ever given me that kind of money and not told me I had to do something with it.
Steve Pomeroy's in the chat, putting lots of data in there. Thanks, Steve. Nimoy, have you given more thought to that too, in terms of what conditionality might look like, particularly around the issues you've got around equity, undoing racism, all the ways in which we've got patterns of exclusion? Should there be conditionality around that? Have you given thought to that particularly, or your colleagues?
I think we've given it a lot of thought. And I think one of the things that is important, in my work that I do, I don't situate like the issues with respect to the contemporary housing crisis with respect to financialization as something that is new, but rather situated as a part of a longer history of dispossession that Black Canadians have faced within this country. And so I think that it's important for us to think about those longer histories, and how do we address this as not just as a housing crisis, but as a part of a broader history of the government's and the state's relations with Black and other racialized and Indigenous people within this country.
Yeah. Thomas, do you want to speak to this example you've just put in the chat where they actually did some conditionality?
Well, yeah. So I think I heard about it on a podcast, to be honest with you. So my knowledge
know the
of the
podcast.
conditionality arrangement is not super deep. But
No, this is a good podcast. This is Ezra Klein talking, and Michael Kimmelman, I think, did it in the New York Times on the weekend. So tell people
Yeah.
about it, and they'll go and maybe I could get Kate to put it in the link. Michael Kimmelman tells this story in the New York Times over the weekend. She'll go digging around for it. So you describe it, Thomas. It's about Houston.
Well, so in Houston, in the States, there's some conditionality placed on funding that flows to homelessness prevention service providers, and that conditionality mandates that they adopt a centralized housing first approach. So a housing first approach, we know from the at-home chez soi pilot program, works. It just works, and it works better than any other kind of approach. And in Houston, that conditionality has paid off in a system that has, over the past decade, more or less, more than halved the number of unsheltered homeless folks that they're measuring in their PIT counts every year. And so I think there are examples where conditionality works.
Yeah.
I think we have to be careful. We have to be careful that the conditionality is in service of the objective, in service of providing housing, and not in service of creating metrics that are going to be fulfilled that justify the decision making sort of from the outset.
And I just want to point out that this is, sometimes the examples come from the least predictable places. Houston is not generally seen as a city that's particularly embracing of equity because they don't have any zoning there, and it's a bit of a wild, wild west example, but they did try something and it worked. I'm wondering if I could go around, or it's working for now, let's see. I'm wondering if I could go around and just ask each person if there's, we often do this at the end of a city talk, if there's one thing in this report or this process that the National Housing Council has been leading to encourage the minister to look at what the national housing strategy needs to evolve to be. There's one thing in this that you would like people to highlight. Can I go to you and ask Cassandra, is there one piece, obvious, other than read the report and read the chat and listen to this recording again? But Cassandra, is there one particular thing?
Yeah, I think just the targeting on towards the most vulnerable, really embedding that human rights approach to housing within the design of the programs.
At the get-go. At the get-go. Okay.
Yeah.
Thomas,
yeah.
What would your one thing be?
I think my one thing would be that bias towards action. I think we need to do and then think and then change and then do again.
So you're quoting Beckett there, which is very good. But the question would be, how do we do that in a way that minimizes risk? Because I think that's the concern. You might do the wrong thing, right? So what's your prescription for that?
I think there are so many places where I think we don't know what the absolute right thing to do is. And I don't think there is an absolutely right thing to do. So I think there are lots of opportunities to do something. And I think we're not going to know until we really try. And I think this is a problem that demands that we take risks. And
so the corollary of that is we have to give government some permission to try some stuff and then not be completely critical of them when it doesn't work. I guess that's the dilemma, right? And there's a risk aversion built into government. I'm going to come to Nimoy, Elizabeth, and then Maya. You'll be the last. So Elizabeth, Nimoy first, then Elizabeth, and then Maya. Go ahead, Nimoy.
I think the one thing that I think that we should do is to find a way in how we can restrict or limit the number of units financialized landlords have under management.
Got it.
I know that there have been talks from the budget to review their impacts on the housing crisis in itself, but as I think someone else has mentioned, I think we're at the point where we need direct action immediately. And if we don't, the fear is that as much as that we continue to think that we're going to build our way out of this crisis and building more housing, we're losing just as much affordable housing due to other policies at other levels of government.
So you want to plug the holes in the bucket first. It's interesting,
Yes.
Steve Pomeroy, again, our colleague from Ottawa, who does a lot of research on this, is saying, let's channel the REITs money into new construction and say hands off of this other vulnerable stock, and then find another way to shore up that vulnerable stock. Elizabeth, and then Maya, one thing.
I'm going to go straight to human rights measurement framework. Bake it into every program so that that actually drives the behaviors on all the other things, so that we are and using the real tools of the human rights framework, which is progressive realization, which doesn't mean let's just do better day by day. It actually has very solid applicable tools of measuring how we're doing. It has accountability, transparency built in, and that's going to drive some of the behaviors of the programs. It will require bringing lands to the table, because it's maximum available resources. That's not just money, it's policy, it's land, it's whatever you have. So really getting into applying a human rights framework to this, I think would produce results that would look different.
So it just becomes baked in at every level. Last word to you, Maya.
Yeah, I would echo everyone's comments. I would say, how do we tie $40 billion to clear, practical, demonstrated human rights outcomes that creates at least some kind of an incentive to use the resources for a broader good. And fundamentally, we're all treaty peoples, and I think we weren't able to do a deeper dive around that with this section of the work, but I think respecting those treaties is very important. Sorry, go ahead.
No, don't be silly. I interrupted you. My apologies. We need a follow-up session dealing more specifically with the implications in Indigenous communities and what the solutions and ideas are in those communities coming out. So we will commit to that. There were a couple of previous sessions that my colleagues from CUI have just posted, which are interesting about, we've had a number of discussions about, the nice weather comes and all of a sudden it's much more visible that people are living rough. So we encourage you to go look at our previous sessions on encampments, and then prior to that, whether supply is the answer or not. And the last thing I just want to say, Maya, maybe we're going to surprise ourselves what $40 billion can do. So let's wait and see. On that hopeful note, I want to thank you all for joining City Talk. As we say, it's never the end of the conversation, it's just the beginning. So thank you, Cassandra, Thomas, Maya, Elizabeth, and Nimoy. Everybody, it's 72 billion. Steve's correcting me again. It's even 100. Let's get 100 billion, for crying out loud. Let's try to see if we can solve this. Read the report. Let's stay in conversation over the next several weeks to see if we can advance this and give the minister the best advice, and all the minister's colleagues across the country in similarly important decision-making roles in different governments. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you.